February 19th, 1980. In the back seat of a Renault 5 parked outside a London flat in the freezing early morning, Ronald Belford Scott, the man who had screamed "Highway to Hell" to millions, lay unconscious, covered in his own vomit. The road he sang about wasn't a metaphor, it was a map, and he had just arrived at the destination. The 33-year-old voice that had defined AC/DC would never wake up. Death by misadventure, the report would say. Death by prophecy, the fans would whisper. Just 6 months after releasing the album that made AC/DC international superstars, Bon Scott died alone in a car, the rock and roll outlaw finally consumed by the character he'd created. His friend Alistair Kinnear, who had been driving that night, claimed he thought Bon was just sleeping it off. Another Tuesday in a life of Tuesdays lost to whiskey. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, Ronald Scott was gone. Only Bon Scott remained, frozen forever at 33, the screamer who never had to grow old. The world received the news with shock that curdled into inevitability. Of course, Bon Scott had died from drinking. How else was this story supposed to end? He had lived the cliché so completely that his death seemed scripted, as if "Highway to Hell" had been less a song than a suicide note set to music. "I'm on the highway to hell," he'd howled, and the world had howled it back, never believing the road had a destination. But was it really as simple as acute alcohol poisoning? Or had Bon Scott been dying for years, slowly erased by the character he played until there was nothing left but the performance? What if the man who said, "I'm not a singer, I'm a screamer," had screamed himself into silence, and nobody noticed because silence wasn't part of the show? To understand how Bon Scott ended up dead in that Renault, we must go back to a displaced boy in Scotland who learned early that survival meant being louder, tougher, more intense than everyone else, and how that lesson would build both a legend and a grave. Ronald Belford Scott was born July 9th, 1946 in Forfar, Scotland, to Charles and Isabel Scott. Post-war Scotland was grey skies and rationing, limited prospects, and lingering trauma. Charles, a baker, saw Australia as escape, and in 1952, when Bon was 6, the family emigrated to Fremantle as part of the Assisted Passage scheme bringing British families to the sunburned continent. Australia was everything Scotland wasn't, wide open, sun-drenched, full of promise. But for young Ronnie, arrival meant exile. His thick Scottish accent marked him instantly as other, the pommy bastard who talked funny and looked pale. School was brutal. Australian kids had no patience for difference, and Ronnie learned survival through volume. Be louder, tougher, more defiant than anyone else. Never show weakness. Never back down. Could these early patterns of fighting for acceptance have laid the foundation for the persona that would eventually consume him? The boy proving himself in schoolyards would become the man proving himself nightly on stages, the performer who could never show fatigue, never admit vulnerability, never let anyone see the scared kid underneath the swagger. But there was music, raw, powerful, cutting through noise and distance. He sang in church choirs, learned drums, discovered rock and roll's dangerous promise of rebellion and escape. By his teens, Bon Scott was already living the pattern that would define him. Dropped out at 15, ran with rough crowds, spent time in juvenile detention. His parents watched helplessly as their son threw away every opportunity they'd sacrificed to give him. Music became salvation and curse. Mid-1960s Australia caught the rock wave from Britain and America, and Bon found his calling in local bands, the Spectres, the Valentines Fraternity. These weren't household names, they were working bands in working venues where you commanded the stage or got bottled off it. Bon learned to outshout hecklers because his survival depended on it. The Valentines brought first success, Australian hits, television appearances, a following. But they were pop, not rock, and something in Bon chafed at constraints. He wanted to roar, not croon. When the Valentines dissolved, he moved to fraternity, more freedom but less success. By 1974, Bon Scott was 28 and going nowhere. A decade in bands, nothing that would last, working odd jobs, waiting tables, laboring, driving trucks to survive. His marriage to Irene Thornton was collapsing, another casualty of prioritizing music over stability. He had talent, charisma, ambition, but time was running out. In music, 28 might as well be 40. Then the phone call that changed everything. The young brothers Malcolm and Angus, Scottish-born like Bon, had AC/DC and they needed a singer. Their original vocalist wasn't working out, and they'd heard about this wild bastard who could drink anyone under the table and sing like a demon. Would he audition? Was the struggle worth it? Would the success justify the years of failure? The answer would be both yes and no. Yes, because Bon would become a legend, and no, because that legend would consume him completely. September 1974. Bon Scott faced two young men who would become his brothers and the witnesses to his destruction. Malcolm Young, rhythm guitarist and musical director, knew exactly what AC/DC should sound like. Angus Young, the lead guitarist in schoolboy uniform, was the visual lightning rod. Together they had a vision, louder, rawer, more dangerous than anything Australia had produced. They needed a frontman who could match their intensity, someone who could make people believe this wasn't just music, this was a threat. When Bon opened his mouth, something clicked. His voice wasn't beautiful, it was weathered, rough, like gravel dragged across asphalt. But it was perfect. It was real. It was the sound of a man who had lived hard and wouldn't apologize. "I'm not a singer," Bon told them. "I'm a shouter, a screamer." And that's exactly what AC/DC needed. Not a singer, but a force of nature, someone who could turn every song into a battle cry. The transformation was immediate. Bon Scott, journeyman rocker, suddenly found himself at the center of something special. AC/DC wasn't just a band, they were a movement, a middle finger to everyone who thought rock had to be complicated or pretentious. Their music was simple, direct, brutal in its honesty, and Bon's lyrics captured it perfectly. Songs about girls, drinking, rock and roll. The simple pleasures of living without apology. Albums came rapid fire, High Voltage, TNT, Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap. Each sold better than the last. But the records were only part of it. The live shows made AC/DC legendary, night after night. Bon Scott proved he wasn't singing about being wild. He was wild, genuinely dangerous. He performed in cut-off denim, sometimes dresses, often shirtless, tattooed body covered in sweat as he prowled the stage like a caged animal freed. He climbed speakers, grabbed at audiences, spat and snarled. Every woman wanted him, every man wanted to be him. Offstage, the legend grew. Drinking competitions, sexual conquests, pranks and fights, and nights ending in cells or hospitals. Bon Scott was becoming exactly what rock and roll promised. A man with no limits, no rules, no tomorrow. But behind the bravado, what was happening to the man inside the myth? Years of struggle had taught Bon to push through exhaustion, to perform sick, to never show weakness. Now success taught something more dangerous. Audiences didn't want Bon Scott the man. They wanted Bon Scott the character, the outlaw who lived without consequences. And Bon, desperate to hold on to success he'd waited so long to find, gave them what they wanted, even when it meant losing himself. The late 1970s brought AC/DC to the world stage, and with them came Bon Scott, the wild man made flesh. The band's sixth album, released July 1979, carried a title that seemed to capture their essence. Highway to Hell. Produced by Mutt Lange, it polished their raw sound without sacrificing power, featuring some of their most iconic songs. The title track became an anthem. Bon's voice howled about living life on his own terms, choosing damnation over redemption. "No stop signs, speed limit, nobody's gonna slow me down," he screamed, and millions screamed it back, turning warning into celebration. Touch too much. Girls got rhythm. If you want blood. Each song was controlled chaos, Angus's guitar perfectly complemented by Bond's lyrics and delivery. The album shot AC/DC to international stardom. No longer just popular in Australia and Europe, they were conquering America, rock's holy grail. Tours sold out, radio played them constantly, and Bon Scott became one of rock's most recognizable faces. 33 years old and finally living the dream he'd chased since adolescence. Money, fame, respect, legions of fans who would follow him anywhere. Picture this. 1979, massive arena, tens of thousands screaming. The opening riff of Highway to Hell begins, that hypnotic, prophetic pulse. Bon stands center stage, denim vest open, microphone gripped like a weapon. The crowd erupts, chanting the lyrics back at him like a religious ritual. "I'm on the highway to hell," they roar. Bon turns slightly, catches his reflection in a monitor, sees the sweat and exhaustion, the hollow eyes behind the snarl. For just a moment, the mask slips. Then he spins back, throws his head back, and screams louder than ever because that's what Bon Scott does. The man might be dying, but the character can never stop performing. Behind all that glamour was their unbearable loneliness nobody saw. The man who sang about Highway to Hell was living it, and the hell wasn't metaphorical. It was constant touring, pressure to maintain the persona, the knowledge that he was expected to be Bon Scott 24 hours a day. He couldn't show fatigue, doubt, or fear because Bon Scott didn't get tired, didn't doubt, didn't fear anything. Friends would later recall warning signs everyone chose to ignore. Bon's drinking, always heavy, was becoming legendary even by rock standards. He'd start drinking in the morning, not stop until he passed out at night. He'd show up to rehearsals drunk, perform shows drunk, do interviews drunk. But instead of being a problem, it became part of his image. Fans expected him drunk. It proved he was authentic, that he really lived the life he sang about. The touring schedule was relentless. A C/DC had worked too hard to slow down now. Always more cities, more fans, more money. Bon threw himself into it with characteristic intensity, never complaining, never asking for breaks, always ready to perform. But human bodies have limits, and Bon was pushing past all of them. Sometimes the mask would slip, and people close to him would glimpse the exhaustion underneath. Bon would talk about feeling tired, wanting to slow down, questioning whether it was worth it. "I don't know how long this ride will last," he wrote to an old friend, "but it's one hell of a ride." The words carried chilling resignation. Bon knew he was burning out, knew the pace was unsustainable, but he couldn't or wouldn't stop. The irony cut deep. Highway to Hell had given AC/DC everything they'd worked for, but it had also trapped them. Now they were expected to be the band that lived fast and played loud, the outlaws who answered to nobody, and Bon, as frontman, bore the heaviest burden. Every interview asked about his wild lifestyle. Every journalist wanted stories of excess. Every photographer wanted to capture the snarl. Bon Scott the man was disappearing behind Bon Scott the character, and nobody seemed to notice or care. Winter 1979 to 1980. AC/DC should have been celebrating. Highway to Hell was massive. They were booked on world tours and they were planning their next album, which everyone expected would be even bigger. But for Bon Scott, celebration felt hollow. He was drinking more than ever, his health was deteriorating, and the gap between who he was and who he was supposed to be was becoming impossible to bridge. The band had moved to London to begin working on new material with Mutt Lange. Sessions were difficult. Bon struggled to write lyrics. His voice showed strain from years of abuse, and his drinking interfered with his ability to work. Malcolm and Angus Young, who had built AC/DC around Bond's persona, found themselves frustrated with their frontman's unreliability. Did this pressure mark Bond's downfall, or was it simply the tipping point of deeper problems building for years? The truth was probably both. Bond had always lived hard, always pushed boundaries, always refused to compromise. But now the stakes were higher, demands were greater, and the margin for error had disappeared. He was supposed to be invincible, but he was human, and humans break. Friends noticed Bond was changing. The man who'd always been full of energy and humor seemed depleted, going through the motions rather than living them. He talked about feeling trapped, wanting to write different songs, being tired of always playing the outlaw. But he didn't know how to change. His entire identity, personal and professional, was built around being rock and roll's wild man. To admit weakness, ask for help, slow down, would betray everything he'd built. Drinking became a bridge between who he was and who he needed to be. Sober, Bond felt the exhaustion and doubt. Drunk, he could be the screamer, the man who lived without regret. It was a vicious cycle. He drank to perform, then needed to drink more to maintain the performance, until eventually the drinking itself became the performance, the only thing keeping the character alive even as it killed the man underneath. Early February 1980, Bond went out for heavy drinking with friends. This wasn't unusual. Bond went out drinking most nights. What was unusual was that this time, he wouldn't come home. The details remain murky, pieced together from recollections of people who were themselves intoxicated. There was a club, music, many drinks, far too many drinks. At some point, Bond became incoherent, unable to walk or speak clearly. Alistair Kinnear decided to drive him home. But Kinnear couldn't get Bond up the stairs to his apartment, so he left him sleeping in the back of his Renault 5 parked outside a London flat. The temperature dropped below freezing, but Kinnear assumed Bond would be fine. He'd seen the singer sleep off dozens of binges before. This was just another Tuesday in the life of Bon Scott, the man who could drink anyone under the table, the outlaw who lived by his own rules. Except this time, he wouldn't wake up. When Kinnear returned the next morning, Bond was unconscious, unresponsive, lips blue from oxygen deprivation. An ambulance was called, but too late. At King's College Hospital, Ronald Belford Scott was pronounced dead. The cause, acute alcohol poisoning, death by misadventure. His blood alcohol level was so high he had essentially drowned in his own vomit, unable to wake as his body shut down. The news spread quickly through the rock world. The response was shock, grief, and an unsettling sense of inevitability. Of course, Bon Scott had died from drinking. How else was he supposed to die? He had lived the rock and roll cliché so completely that his death seemed almost scripted, the logical conclusion to a story that could only end one way. "I'll live fast, die young, and maybe leave a few good songs," Bond had once joked. Now the joke was reality, except nobody was laughing. Can anyone ever truly escape from the shadow of their darkest moments? For Bon Scott, the question became irrelevant because he never tried to escape. He had embraced the darkness, made it his identity, turned his demons into art. The same intensity that made him a great performer destroyed him as a person, and by the time he might have wanted to change, it was too late. He had become Bon Scott, the character, so completely that Ronald Scott, the man, had ceased to exist. The aftermath of Bon Scott's death was complicated by guilt, grief, and the nagging question of whether anyone could have saved him. Malcolm and Angus Young were devastated. They had lost not just a singer, but a brother. But mixed with grief was defensive anger, a refusal to accept they might have enabled Bond's self-destruction by celebrating and profiting from the behaviors that killed him. The music industry turned Bond's death into a morality tale, a warning about excess and rock lifestyle. But the warning was hollow, delivered by an industry that had encouraged and promoted that lifestyle, that had made millions selling the fantasy that rock stars could live without consequences. Bon Scott hadn't invented living fast and dying young. He had just been more committed to it than most. In Australia, where Bon was remembered as a local boy made good, grief was more personal. Thousands attended his funeral in Fremantle, where he was cremated and his ashes scattered. His gravestone in Fremantle Cemetery became a pilgrimage site, adorned with whiskey bottles, guitar picks, and notes from people who felt they'd lost someone they knew intimately, even if they'd never met him. A C/DC faced a difficult decision: continue without Bon, or break up in respect. Industry wisdom suggested they should break up. Replacing a frontman as distinctive as Bon seemed impossible. But Malcolm and Angus decided to continue, partly as tribute. Bon would have wanted them to carry on, and partly because they'd invested too much to stop. They found Brian Johnson, a British singer with similar raspy voice, and quickly recorded Back in Black, an album that would become one of the best-selling records of all time. Back in Black was dedicated to Bon Scott, and songs like the title track served as memorial and continuation. AC/DC would honor Bon by doing exactly what he would have wanted: rock harder than ever. But the album also marked a shift. Brian Johnson brought energy and talent, but not Bon's danger, his sense of genuine chaos. A C/DC became more polished, more professional, more palatable. They became hugely successful, but something was lost. The feeling that at any moment everything could spiral out of control. The question that haunted everyone was whether Bon's death could have been prevented. The answer was almost certainly yes, if he had drunk less, if someone had stayed with him that night, if he had sought help for his alcoholism, if the people around him had been more concerned with his health than his ability to perform. But rock and roll in the 1970s didn't work that way. Weakness was anathema, asking for help was betrayal, and moderation was for people who didn't have what it took to be legends. Were these final months acts of surrender, or simply living the only way he knew how? The distinction might not matter. Bon Scott had made choices throughout his life: to pursue music despite odds, to embrace a persona that demanded everything, to prioritize intensity over longevity. Those choices gave the world some of rock's greatest anthems and one of its most compelling frontmen. They also gave the world another young corpse, another cautionary tale nobody would heed, another legend that would inspire more to follow the same destructive path. His ex-wife, Irene, was devastated, haunted by memories of the gentle man behind the wild image. His parents, who had emigrated dreaming of a better life for their son, struggled to understand how that dream ended with their boy dead in a car at 33. His bandmates grappled with knowing they'd been there, watched it happen, perhaps even contributed, and done nothing to stop it. The years following Bon's death brought gradual reassessment of his legacy, complicated by competing narratives. To AC/DC's fan base, Bon remained the band's true voice, the Brian Johnson era seen as commercially successful, but spiritually compromised. Fans debated endlessly, but there was no question Bon had given AC/DC something irreplaceable: authenticity, rawness, a sense the music came from lived experience rather than calculated image. Musicians who came after cited him as influence. Some admired his vocal style, that raspy scream cutting through heavy guitar. Others pointed to his lyrical approach, writing about sex and drinking without seeming juvenile, finding poetry in the profane. Still others were drawn to his stage presence, commanding attention without gimmicks. Bon Scott was captivating simply by being himself, or at least the version he showed the world. But perhaps the most significant part of Bon's legacy was what he represented: the archetype of the rock outlaw, the man who refused to compromise, who lived by his own rules regardless of consequences. This image resonated deeply, particularly with young men who saw in Bon a reflection of their own rebellious impulses, their desire to break free. The problem was this image was built on self-destruction, and celebrating it meant celebrating the behaviors that killed him. In 2004, fans in Fremantle unveiled a statue of Bon Scott, immortalizing him in bronze with guitar in hand and that characteristic snarl. Thousands attended, many traveling from around the world to pay tribute to a man most had never met. The statue became a gathering place, decorated with flowers, bottles, handwritten notes expressing what Bon's music meant to them. It was touching but strange, a permanent monument to impermanence, celebration of a man who burned bright and brief. A C/DC continued performing Bon's songs throughout decades, keeping his music alive as the man faded into history. Brian Johnson sang Highway to Hell and Whole Lotta Rosie, doing his best to honor Bon's memory while making the songs his own. But there was always an element of tribute, acknowledgement that these were Bon's songs, Bon's words, Bon's legacy. The band he'd helped build outlasted him by decades, but his shadow remained, a presence that could never quite be replaced or forgotten. Was Bon Scott's death as straightforward as reported, or were there more sinister forces at play? The conspiracy theories were mild, no claims of murder or cover-ups, just questions about whether more could have been done, whether anyone should be held accountable. Some blamed Kinnear for leaving Bon in the car. Others blamed the band for enabling his drinking. Still others argued Bon himself was responsible, that his death was inevitable from choices made freely. The truth was more complex than any single explanation. Bon Scott died because of a combination, his own choices certainly, but also the cultural context that celebrated those choices, the industry that profited from them, the fans who demanded he embody the image, and the friends and family unable or unwilling to intervene. His death was both accident and inevitability, random tragedy and predictable outcome. The medical report was clear: acute alcohol poisoning, death by misadventure. Bon had drunk himself to death, as simple and tragic as that. No hidden drugs, no foul play, no mysterious circumstances. He had simply consumed more alcohol than his body could process, passed out in a position where he couldn't breathe properly, and died. A death that happened to alcoholics every day, made notable only by the victim's fame. But the simplicity of the medical explanation belied the complexity of what led to that moment. This wasn't just about one night. It was about a lifetime building toward that night, making choices that seemed harmless in isolation but accumulated into a fatal pattern. Every drink, every performance fueled by alcohol, every interview joking about excess, every fan interaction playing the unstoppable rocker, all of it building to that February night when his body finally gave out. Some who knew Bon well believed his death wasn't entirely accidental, that on some level he had wanted it, that he'd been slowly killing himself for years and finally succeeded. They pointed to his increasing depression, his comments about not knowing how much longer he could keep up the pace, his sense of being trapped. Whether consciously or unconsciously, Bon might have been courting death, testing limits until he finally found them. Others rejected this interpretation, insisting Bon loved life and performing, that he was looking forward to the next album and tour, that he had plans and dreams extending beyond that fatal night. His death was an accident, they maintained, a terrible tragedy but not suicide. Bon had simply miscalculated, drunk more than he realized, been left in unfortunate circumstances by friends who didn't understand the danger. The debate was perhaps irrelevant. Whether Bon consciously chose death or stumbled into it drunk and unaware, the result was the same. A 33-year-old man dead, a band without its voice, a family without their son. and a music world contemplating another bright light extinguished too soon. The live, fast, die young philosophy that had seemed romantic suddenly looked like what it was: a death sentence, a formula for creating legends and corpses in equal measure. What hidden truths about rock lifestyle died with Bon Scott that night? Perhaps the biggest secret was how unsustainable it all was, how the image of the indestructible rocker was just that. An image, a performance, a lie everyone agreed to believe until it killed someone. Bon had been one of the best at maintaining that performance, at making people believe he really was immune to consequences. His death shattered that illusion, proving what everyone should have known. Rock excess isn't glamorous. It's just destructive, and eventually, it destroys you. In decades since, the rock world has seen countless others follow similar paths. Some dying, others managing to pull back before too late. Each time there's reflection, questions about whether the culture needs to change, whether celebrating excess is really worth the cost. And each time the answer seems to be yes, it is worth it, that the mythology is more important than the lives it claims, that we need our rock outlaws even if it means sacrificing them on entertainment's altar. Bon Scott's legacy is complicated precisely because it forces us to confront these uncomfortable truths. He was a brilliant performer, gifted lyricist, charismatic frontman who helped create some of rock's most enduring anthems. He was also an alcoholic who died choking on his own vomit in a car, a cautionary tale about believing your own mythology. Both things are true and neither diminishes the other. Bon Scott was great, and Bon Scott died unnecessarily, and we can acknowledge both without choosing which matters more. The music remains. That's perhaps the most important legacy. Songs like Highway to Hell, Whole Lotta Rosie, and Let There Be Rock continue blasting from speakers worldwide, introducing new generations to Bon's voice and vision. In those 3-minute bursts of raw power, Bon Scott lives forever, eternally young, eternally wild, eternally screaming defiance at a world that wanted him to be something other than what he was. The songs don't mention loneliness, exhaustion, fear, the slow erosion of self. They give us only the myth, the legend, the performance. And maybe that's how Bon would have wanted it. He spent his entire adult life crafting that image, sacrificing everything to maintain it. In death, he became it completely, the rock outlaw, frozen in time at 33, forever the wild man of AC/DC, never having to face compromise and accommodation that comes with age. He never had to watch himself get older, slower, weaker. He never had to see his voice fade or his body fail beyond what alcohol had already done. He never had to become a nostalgia act or a cautionary presence at award shows. He just burned bright and went out, leaving nothing but songs and stories. The answer to whether it was worth it depends on who you ask and what you value. To millions who found joy and liberation in his music, who felt their own rebellious spirits reflected in his lyrics, the answer might be yes. Bon Scott's brief life gave the world something valuable enough to justify the cost. To his family, his friends, people who knew Ronald Scott rather than Bon Scott, the answer would likely be no. No amount of great music is worth a life. No legend is worth losing someone you love. Perhaps the real lesson isn't about rock and roll at all, but about the danger of becoming your own mythology. Bon created a character, the screamer, the shouter, the outlaw, and that character became so successful, so beloved, so profitable, that Bon the man disappeared behind it. He couldn't retire the character without losing everything, couldn't admit weakness without betraying the image, couldn't be human without destroying the legend. So he chose the legend, and the legend killed him. How many others are making the same choice right now? How many performers are sacrificing their health, relationships, lives to maintain images that demand everything and give back only fame and money? How many fans are complicit, demanding their heroes remain larger than life even when they're clearly falling apart? The industry built on Bon Scott's grave continues operating the same way, continues celebrating the same dangerous behaviors, continues turning self-destruction into marketing material. Bon Scott proved you don't need to live long to leave a lasting mark. 33 years was enough to help create a musical legacy enduring for decades. He showed that authenticity, even when self-destructive, resonates more deeply than careful image management. He demonstrated that rock, at its best, comes from genuine feeling, genuine experience, genuine living, even when that living is killing you. But he also proved, though he probably didn't intend to, that the rock dream is built on quicksand, that the lifestyle it celebrates is ultimately unsustainable, that live fast, die young works better on t-shirts than as life philosophy. Bon Scott lived the dream completely without compromise or restraint, and it killed him. Whether that makes him hero or victim or simply human is something each person must decide. What remains undeniable is that rock lost something irreplaceable when Bon Scott died in that car in London. Not just a great voice or charismatic performer, but a certain authenticity, a connection to working-class roots that spawned the music. Bon Scott was a pub rocker who happened to become famous, never losing sight of where he came from, even as he played to bigger crowds. His death marked the beginning of rock's transformation from rebel art to corporate product, from something dangerous to something managed. In the end, perhaps the highway to hell wasn't a metaphor at all. Perhaps it was exactly what Bon Scott said it was. A road he chose to travel knowing where it led, unable or unwilling to turn back. He sang about it, he lived it, and finally he arrived. The tragedy isn't that he got there. The tragedy is that we celebrated every mile of the journey, cheered him on as he accelerated toward his own destruction, then acted surprised when he reached the end. Bon Scott died having never compromised, never sold out, never betrayed the image he'd created. But that image cost him everything, his health, his relationships, ultimately his life. He proved you could be exactly what you wanted to be in rock and roll, as long as what you wanted to be was willing to die for it. And in that proof lies both his greatest achievement and deepest tragedy. He became the character he created so completely that there was nothing left of the man, and when the man died, the character became immortal. Bon Scott hid behind the scream his entire life, and the world loved him for it until it killed him. Now we return to that Renault 5, that freezing London morning, that moment when Ronald Scott stopped breathing, and only Bon Scott remained. The voice that had howled defiance was silent. The outlaw who lived without rules was dead, and rock and roll, that beautiful, terrible thing, had claimed another sacrifice, another legend, another proof that some roads, once you start down them, only have one destination. The question that lingers unanswerable. Would Bon Scott make the same choices if he could do it again? Would he choose the shorter, brighter burn over a longer, quieter life? Would he trade everything that came after for a few more years? Would he tell the young musicians who idolize him to follow his path or run far away? We'll never know. All we have are the songs, the stories, and the statue in Fremantle, a bronze reminder that rock creates legends by consuming the people who make it. Bon Scott gave us Highway to Hell and paid for it with his life. And we continue singing along, continue celebrating, continue pretending the next one will somehow be different, that the next wild-eyed screamer won't end up dead at 33 in the back of a car. But here's the question we should be asking ourselves. Do we want our heroes to survive, or do we want them to sacrifice themselves so we can worship at the altar of their mythology? Are we willing to let them be human, flawed, mortal? Or do we demand they stay on that highway to hell while we chant along from safety, complicit in their destruction, celebrating their suffering as entertainment? Because every time we scream highway to hell in a bar or at a concert, every time we toast to living fast and dying young, every time we romanticize the rock and roll lifestyle that killed Bon Scott, we're choosing the myth over the man. We're saying that we value the 3 minutes of music more than the 33 years of life it cost. We're perpetuating the cycle that will claim the next Bon Scott, and the one after that, and the one after that. Bon Scott didn't just die in a Renault 5 on a freezing London morning. He died every time someone chose the character over the person, the performance over the human being, the legend over the truth. He died when success came too late and meant too much. He died when nobody stopped him because stopping him would have meant admitting the dream was a nightmare. He died when we all agreed to believe the lie that you could live that way forever, right up until the moment you couldn't. The highway to hell isn't a metaphor, it's not a song, it's not a lifestyle choice. It's a road that Bon Scott traveled to its end, and his death is the road sign warning everyone who comes after. This way leads to destruction, no matter how much we celebrate the journey. The only question is whether anyone will read the sign, or whether we'll keep sending our heroes down that same road, cheering them on until they too arrive at the destination. Bon Scott proved you could become immortal by dying young. But immortality is cold comfort when you're dead at 33, choking alone in the back of a car, having sacrificed everything, including yourself, to become the myth that people would rather remember than the man they never really knew.